So hi, everybody. My name is Eran Toch. I'm a faculty member at Tel Aviv University's Department of Industrial Engineering, and I'm working on usable security and privacy. It is my great honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Anne Cavoukian. I am honored to present her. She's one of the individuals that had the most profound effect on shaping and promoting privacy in the last couple of decades, maybe in all of humanity's history. She was appointed the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario's Canada's new Information and Privacy Office, and she really created and shaped that office, not just in Ontario, but all around the world. There she has created Privacy by Design, a framework that seeks to embed privacy in information technologies from the get-go and in organizational projects. And we see in the last couple of years that this has a huge influence on the way systems are created because of the legislation and other factors. And I hope she's going to talk about this today. But it's a good time to remember that we all live right now in a world that is shaped by Privacy by Design and by Anne Cavoukian. So Anne, your floor. No, you're on mute, naturally.
I apologize. How is this? Is this okay? Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm honored to be able to speak to all of you today. And I will, of course, be talking about Privacy by Design, but I'm also going to talk about the threats to our privacy in this growing world of tracking and surveillance. Of course, we live in a COVID-19 pandemic world, and the pressure to collect more and more personally identifying information is growing dramatically, unfortunately. So I'll touch upon all of these things. And I'll start by, I've sent you my slides, so they will be shared with you. But I just want to start with what privacy is and what it is not. And I always want to start by getting rid of the myth that privacy is all about secrecy. That's nonsense. Privacy is not about secrecy. It's about control, personal control relating to the uses of your personal information. You see, I always tell people, if you want to give away your information, be my guest. Privacy is not a religion. As long as you make the decision to do so and you think it through. User control is critical in terms of your personal information. Freedom of choice to decide who you wish to share your information with and to whom you wish to disclose it. The Germans have a wonderful term for this called Informational Self-Determination. That it should be the individual who determines the fate of his or her personal information, not the government, not a private sector, not your parents or your spouse. You get to decide. Privacy has nothing to do with secrecy. It's all about personal choice. Privacy is also essential to our freedom. It's a necessary condition for societal prosperity and well-being. I like to emphasize that because innovation, creativity, and the resultant prosperity of a society requires freedom. Privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. It's essential. Without privacy, individual human rights, property rights, civil liberties, all of this, which are the conceptual engines of innovation and creativity, they couldn't exist in any kind of meaningful manner. I always like to give the example of Steve Jobs, the brilliant creator of Apple. He used to buy a new white Mercedes car every year, every 6 months, less a day. So 6 months less a day, he would take his existing car to the dealership and buy a new one. And then he would drive that for 6 months less a day and then take it to the dealership and buy a new one. Why would you do that, you might wonder? Because at that time in California, when you bought a new car, you had up to 6 months before you had to get a license plate number on it. Steve Jobs didn't want to be tracked. He didn't want a license plate on his car and people could follow him. So this is what he did. Unfortunately, after he died, they changed the law in California, and you have to get a license plate right away. I've been talking about how privacy fuels our innovation and creativity. Surveillance is the exact opposite. Surveillance is the antithesis of privacy. It shrinks our cognitive bandwidth. It makes us go inward. Sorry, I'm a psychologist. That's how I talk. Because if you want brilliant creativity and innovation and blue sky thinking, you can't have someone watching over you. You can't be in a surveillance world where you're constantly looking over your shoulder, fearful about what's going on. No, that just takes us inward. It shrinks our cognitive bandwidth. We want the opposite. We want the freedom to think about wild and crazy ideas. And that's where we get the apples of the world. So let me now turn to privacy by design. If you're following my slides, you'll see that privacy by design, I call it the decade of privacy by design because in 2010, it was unanimously passed as an international standard. When I was privacy commissioner for 3 terms, I went to the International Conference on Privacy and Data Protection, where I had enjoyed being a commissioner for so many years. And the conferences were usually in Europe. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem. And at the end of a 3 or 4 day conference, you have a half-day session where commissioners are allowed to introduce resolutions that the entire assembly of commissioners would vote upon. And I introduced a resolution in 2010 that privacy by design should complement regulatory compliance, that regulatory compliance kicks in after the data breach or privacy infraction takes place and then offers remedies. I wanted a model of prevention, much like a medical model of prevention, where you can prevent the privacy harms from arising. That's what privacy by design is all about. You try to invoke proactive measures up front, bake it into the code, bake it into your policies and operations so that you can prevent the privacy harms from arising. And I was very fortunate. It was unanimously passed as an international standard and in 2010, and it complements regulatory compliance. And since then, it's been translated into over 40 languages. I've been so fortunate. Not a week would go by when I was commissioner when I wouldn't hear from some jurisdiction. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful time to be doing this. Now, 2 essentials to privacy by design, and this I want to emphasize dramatically. Oh, but first I should also mention, I think I'm talking about the GDPR later on, but as you know, privacy by design has been included in the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, which in itself is huge. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the 2 essentials to privacy by design: be proactive, prevent the privacy harms from arising, model of prevention. The second one is banish zero-sum models. Zero-sum means you can only have a positive gain in one area, say security, always to the detriment of the other area, privacy, so that the 2 total to a sum of 0. Well, it was never privacy that won over security, nor am I suggesting it should be, but I sure as heck am not going to lose out on privacy because of this stupid dated zero-sum either or model. It's a win-lose model where only one interest can win. Get rid of that. What you want 2 positive sum interests. Positive sum means you can have 2 positive gains at the same time. It's a win-win model. And it's as simple and as difficult as getting rid of versus, one interest versus another, win-lose. Get rid of that. Substitute and, one interest plus another, 2 positive goals at the same time. So that's what I want you to do. And I remember talking to Bruce Schneier about this years ago, a brilliant cryptographer, a dear friend of mine. And he said, Anne, this either or model consists of unnecessary trade-offs and false dichotomies. You don't need that. Get rid of it. Do both. I love that. So that's what privacy by design is all about. And I'll just run you through the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design very quickly. The first, I've already talked to you about it being proactive, not reactive. You want to get ahead of it. The second foundational principle is critical. It's called privacy as the default setting. What that means is instead of expecting your customers or citizens to wade through all the terms of service and all the legalese in the privacy policy to look for the opt-out box, which says, do not use my personal information for any purpose other than the intended primary purpose of the data protection, of the data collection, which is what I've consented to. Now, instead of expecting everyone to do that, which takes hours to wade through the terms of service and the privacy policy, and we know nobody does it. You know, life is short, but it's not because people don't care about privacy. People care deeply about privacy. In the last 2 years, all of the public opinion polls, Pew Research, etc., have come in at the 90 percentile for concern for privacy. 90% very concerned about their privacy. 92% concerned about loss of control over personal information, their personal information. And remember, I said that privacy equals control. So what does privacy as the default do? It flips that on its head. It says to customers, citizens, users, you don't have to ask for privacy. We give it to you automatically. It's embedded as the default setting in all of our operations. You get privacy automatically. We can only use your personal information for the primary purpose of the data collection that you consented to. Beyond that, we can't use it for any other reason. If down the road a secondary use arises that we would like to use your personal information for, no problem. We have to come back to you and seek your positive consent. This is huge. This builds trust like no other. Companies that have adopted privacy by design and have become certified for it have told me that this builds trust like no other. And there's such a trust deficit right now. So use privacy by design, privacy as the default, to build trusted business relationships. And you gain a competitive advantage by doing so. That's the beauty of this. The third foundational principle, privacy embedded into the design of your operations. See, if you embed privacy into your design, into your code, then it's not an afterthought. It's something you have to do. And it's part of the system. It's automatically there. It's wonderful. I've already talked about full functionality, number 4 principle, all about get rid of zero-sum either-or models and substitute positive-sum win-win models. That's what I want you to do. And let me talk about security for a moment, number 5. While the term privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections and security alone, in this day and age of daily privacy infractions and data breaches, if you don't have a strong foundation of privacy from end to end with full lifecycle protection, you're not going to have any privacy. So please embed privacy by ensuring security. That's what is absolutely critical. You have to have a strong base of security. Visibility and transparency, keeping it open, is absolutely critical. Tell your customers what you're doing. Let them know about your operations and be transparent. Let them access their data, etc. And the 7th principle is respect for user privacy. If you keep it user-centric, focused on the user, then you're golden. That'll work perfectly.
And I just verified. Do you have slides? Because you didn't share any.
Sorry, I sent it to the organizers who are going to distribute it to you. Okay, let me just continue. Now, just in case you're wondering, maybe this sounds good, but it's too difficult, you know, to actually do privacy by design. Au contraire. Years ago, we published a publication, 2014, I think, called Operationalizing Privacy by Design, which is all about it's about 22 companies that worked with me while I was privacy commissioner to show how you can do privacy by design. Think of any of the big companies. Think of Microsoft, Intel, HPE, Oracle, IBM, I'm sure I'm leaving out many of them. We did 22 papers on various aspects of privacy by design to show that it could in fact be operationalized in RFIDs, in surveillance cameras, in biomedical data, remote home health care, big data, smart meters, all of these. So take a look at the paper, Operationalizing Privacy by Design, which is a compilation of 22 papers we did. And just in case you think, oh, maybe this doesn't work in terms of the GDPR, it's Article 25 of the GDPR. Let me tell you that it does. Here's a letter I got from JIPDEC, the Japanese Information Processing Development Center, years ago, in terms of the positive sum aspect. And I'm just going to quote from it. They said, "We've heard from Japan's private sector companies that we need to insist on the principle of a positive sum, not zero sum, and become enlightened with privacy by design." I love that, because I thought if the Japanese could embrace privacy by design and positive sum, not zero sum, and it's not their, English isn't their primary language, then surely the rest of us can figure out how to do this. And you might say, well, okay, but what's it going to cost me? It's probably going to be really expensive. Of course, there is a cost associated with doing privacy by design proactively, but it is a fraction of the cost you will incur by not doing it. So if you're proactive, you'll spend a small amount to embed this into the design of your operations. But if you don't do this, I guarantee you'll have a privacy infraction or data breach or some other privacy intrusion. And these days, it doesn't just cost, it's not just a lawsuit, they're class action lawsuits. The cost of not doing privacy by design is staggering, in the millions upon millions. But the damage to your brand, the damage to your reputation may be irreparable. The loss of consumer confidence and trust closes businesses down. There was, I'll give you an example, in North America, there was this company called Target, which was a US-based company, and they expanded to Canada years ago. Target had a breach years ago as well, major breach in the United States. It was huge. The CEO of Target in the United States resigned. The president of Target in Canada was fired. And in a few months, Target was shut down in Canada. Their business just dried up. We no longer have Target stores in Canada. It's gone. So that's why you have to be very, very careful. Excuse me. Now, I mentioned the GDPR earlier. I know you're all familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation, but it is huge. It came into effect in 2018, and it is so far-reaching, as I'm sure you're aware. It embeds personal control into the language of the privacy law, the data protection law, in the GDPR. And for the first time ever, it includes my privacy by design framework and privacy as the default setting. Privacy by design, or data protection by design, as it's called in Europe, is huge. And the fact that they included privacy as the default is absolutely amazing. I'm going to read you a quote from Information Age, which I would never be so bold to say this, but they said this. They said, "It's not too much of a stretch to say that if you implement privacy by design, you've mastered the GDPR." I would not be so bold as to say that, trust me, never, because that's just, there's much more to the GDPR than privacy by design. But I think the fact that she references means that if you rise up and do privacy by design proactively, then you will cover much of what is being sought in terms of the protections of the GDPR. So I think that's what it was meant to say. Now let me turn to surveillance for a moment. Unfortunately, is the tide now turning to surveillance? You know, this dates back to 2016 in the UK, where they passed the Investigatory Powers Bill, which was huge. It's all about surveillance. And there was a huge petition against it in the UK to repeal the new surveillance powers. And this reached well over 100,000 signatures because they didn't want this. Unfortunately, the UK, the mass digital surveillance regime continues, no matter how unlawful it may be considered. All over the world, however, surveillance is now becoming the new normal of the internet. It's the business model of the internet. That's what Bruce Schneier said a few years ago. And it all has to do with the unintended consequences of your data. I call this the data fumes, what happens as a result of data that was never intended. The increasing availability of these data fumes, which are data produced as a byproduct of people's use of technological devices and services. This has both political and practical implications for the way that people are seen and treated by the state, by one's government, and by the private sector. So this is what concerns me. And people often think, well, we just have to worry about the private sector, not about the government, in terms of surveillance capitalism. Yes, you have to be concerned about the private sector, of course, but let me assure you, you have to be equally concerned about the government. Don't think governments don't want to control your personal information. When I was privacy commissioner here in Canada, for 3 terms, each term there was a different political party that was in power. And before they became the government, they were all for privacy and wanted to protect people's data and give personal control to the data subject. The minute they became the government, all of that changed. All of a sudden, they wanted to be in control of the data, not the individual. So we have to be very wary of this. The Internet of Things, let me speak for a moment about that. IoT, when I think of IoT attacks, I always say it's the when, not the if, because IoT is like the Wild West, racing out the door at breakneck speed, so excited about all the new developments. And they're doing this without taking the time to embed privacy protective measures into the Internet of Things. Protect the data. Embed this, bake it into your code. They're not doing that. And that's the problem. I'm going to read a quote relating to this that says, the question companies should be asking is no longer whether there will be an attack involving Internet of Things devices, IoT devices, and infrastructure, but when. Basically saying, for sure, you're going to have some kind of attack. It's just a matter of time. Unless you embed privacy by design into the operations, into the IoT. And if you don't do that, I mean, identity theft has grown dramatically. I have one figure from 2016, 4 years ago. 1.1 billion identities were stolen in 2016. I'm guessing you can double that now. That's how dramatic this is. I like to emphasize the vital need for encryption. I focus on that increasingly. I've done quite a few op-eds on this. You'll see one in the slides, which you will get after my presentation, where one that I wrote said, encryption is crucial to our privacy and our freedom. You have to do this. Now, unfortunately, there's been a big debate about encryption, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And this dates back, this is in terms of backdoors. Governments want backdoors to break encryption. Oh, because they're there to protect us, right? It's all for us. It's nonsense. They want access to the data. And this started years ago when there was something called the Clipper chip. I was actually around then, early 2000s, I was commissioner. And we spent a full year with cryptographers and everyone all around the world debating the benefits or lack thereof of the Clipper chip, which was a backdoor to encrypted devices. At the end of the year, there was a vote. Everyone voted against the Clipper chip. They said, no, the intrusions into privacy will be dramatic and that cannot be tolerated. And this is huge because everyone knows that if you create another port of entry into data, encrypted data, it will not be just arguably the good guys, the government, who will have access to it. The bad guys will find out about it in a heartbeat. They will learn about it and they will use it to their advantage. They'll break into your code. So we have to get rid of this. That was 20 years ago. A few years ago, once again, there was another attempt to create backdoors in governments all around the world. It was very strong in the United States. And to my delight, cryptographers from all around the world, 15 of them, wrote a document called Keys Under Doormats. And the reason they called it Keys Under Doormats, they wanted the average person to understand that if you put a key under the doormat for your child, just in case he loses his key, to facilitate your child gaining entry into your home, it will also facilitate the bad guys gaining entry into your home. They said, and I quote, mandating insecurity by requiring government access to all data and communications, backdoors. They said, this is a nightmare. This will just make things fall apart, and it is a nightmare. And that's what we have to be worried about. We cannot allow backdoors to be created into our communications. I don't know how to drive this home other than to continue repeating it, because there's nothing worse than the prospect of backdoors, and it's being debated again and again. Just earlier this year, it was being debated as to the benefits of doing this. And the thing is, of course we have to catch the bad guys, but we do that by having targeted surveillance, not indiscriminate widespread surveillance, which is what backdoors would engage in, basically phishing expeditions. We can't have that. We need privacy and security. We must have both, and backdoors are the exact opposite. It's, let me just read a quote to you from a professor here in Canada at Queen's University, Professor David Lyon. He said, and we're talking about the Patriot Act, he said, these types of attempts of creating backdoors have no use in stopping terror attacks. Many security experts insist that much more targeted surveillance works far better. And targeted surveillance means if you have probable cause to think, you're law enforcement, that something is going on, then you get a warrant and you target the surveillance on that area. You have a reason to believe that you should pursue it. That's what we have to do. And so many people have agreed with this, privacy and security. Here in the United States, Michael Chertoff, when he was Secretary of Homeland Security, he said, you cannot have privacy without security. To me, the most frustrating thing is when people treat privacy and security as if they were trade-offs. No. And NSA chief Michael Rogers, a number of years ago, said the same thing, staking out a pro-encryption position in contrast to the FBI. He said encryption is the foundation to the future. And arguing about it, it's a waste of time. While there's been a lot of talk about giving up some privacy for security, you must have both. Both are paramount. And this is why I so want us to remember this. Tech groups have rejected calls for backdoors for many, many years. And they've said it weakens encryption dramatically. The Information Technology Industry Council said that weakening encryption or creating backdoors for the use by the good guys would actually create vulnerabilities to be exploited by the bad guys. Weakening encryption is never a solution. And that's what I always want to remind people whenever anyone in your government may want to embrace the possibility of creating crypto backdoors. Don't let them. Professor Susan Landau in the United States, she appeared before the Technology for House Judiciary Committee hearing on what's called the encryption tightrope, balancing America's security and privacy. She's brilliant. She's a dear colleague of mine, brilliant cryptographer. And she said, and I'm going to read her quote, she said, rather than providing us with better security, the FBI's efforts to mandate the creation of crypto backdoors will actually torpedo it. That's how strong it was. It will torpedo it. She said, this is no solution. We have to get rid of this talk of backdoors. And this is unfortunately going to continue this debate for a very long time. That's my concern. No matter how strong the arguments against it are, it's just not going to work. You know, there is so much misunderstanding about crypto backdoors, and the government fuels this because they would like nothing better than to gain access to your encrypted communications. It's not just finding the bad guys. They want to be in control, and I know this from the times, as I mentioned, when I was privacy commissioner. So let us try very hard to get rid of this crypto backdoor discussion. Now, I'm going to turn, just for the last short while in my talk, to facial recognition, because facial recognition is just a nightmare. It creates more false positives than you would believe. First and foremost, facial recognition is largely invisible. You don't know it's taking place. It's operating in the background, and your facial image is the most sensitive biometric in existence. It deserves the strongest protection possible. It basically captures your facial image without any notice, no consent, no personal control whatsoever. And it's being used not just by the police, of course, it's being used by the police, but it's being used by private sector companies in you know, department stores, in malls, shopping centers. There was an example maybe 8 months ago in Canada. It's called the Cadillac Fairview Mall, a very large mall consisting of hundreds of shopping stores, etc. And they were using facial recognition unbeknownst to individuals. And when someone learned about this and put the word out, that was it. No one was gonna go to that mall anymore until they shut it down. They literally were forced to shut it down because there were so many complaints that were lodged with our Federal Privacy Commissioner of Canada. So while he's investigating, the malls, you know, finally said, okay, we're going to shut this down until we get a ruling from him, because people think it's very privacy invasive, which it is. Now, I want to tell you something. There's an amazing Israeli company called DID, capital D dash, capital I, capital D. This is amazing. Check it out. DID, company based in Israel. I'm on their board. And what they do, they obfuscate facial recognition features so that it can't occur. It can't take place. So what they do is, you will, let's say you're doing facial recognition on me. You'll still see my face. You'll be able to probably tell that it's Anne Cavoukian, but your facial recognition technology won't work. It won't register. And that's the beauty of it. And I love this because they say, unlike passwords, you cannot change your face. It is the most sensitive biometric out there. And as more systems adopt facial recognition, the risk to our privacy, of course, escalates dramatically. And all organizations that handle facial images, corporations as well as governments, face new challenges involving regulatory requirements, growing privacy concerns, and sensitive security issues. I've been studying this for a long time. A conservative estimate, comes out of a study in the UK, where in England they've had facial cameras, CCTV cameras, like 4.2 million cameras, more than anywhere else in the world in one jurisdiction. And they've been using facial recognition for some time. 81% of the images, the facial recognition, they're false positives, meaning they falsely identify someone as being the bad guy, the person of interest. 81%. Try to clear your name of identity theft when that happens. When I was privacy commissioner, a number of individuals came to me seeking my assistance in helping them. They were victims of identity theft. And they said, the credit card companies don't believe it wasn't me who racked up all those charges. It wasn't me. My identity was stolen. And I always used to tell them, the first thing you should do, go to the police and file an occurrence report, something to validate your claim that your identity was stolen. And then I would work with them behind the scenes to try to clear this up. It can take years sometimes. There was a study that came out just about a month ago in Detroit, in the United States, Detroit. 96% of their facial recognition matches were false positives. 96%. I mean, it's ridiculous. We have to stop doing this. And DID in Israel is just amazing. Please, please check them out, because what they offer is their groundbreaking technology produces images that are unrecognizable to face recognition algorithms. But it keeps it similar to the human eye, so it still looks like Cavoukian, but the my facial image will be unrecognizable to a facial recognition algorithm, which is beautiful. So DID's facial distortion is specifically designed to make it difficult for artificial intelligence to overcome, and that's the beauty of this. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've been talking for a long time. I'm going to stop in 2 minutes, but I just want to touch on COVID-19 and the push for contact tracing. This is going to continue growing, and I want to alert you to the flaws in most contact tracing apps that are being developed, which can identify individuals. That's the last thing you want. Apple, Google worked together, possibly for the first time, to develop an amazing, they don't call it contact tracing, they call it facial identification. What it does is it allows the exposure notification. It's called a facial Apple Google exposure notification app. And they called it exposure notification because if you download the app created from the Apple Google API, you will be notified of whether you've been exposed to someone who was within 6 feet or 2 meters of you who had tested positive for COVID-19. It is amazing. No personal information is collected, totally privacy protective, no geolocation data. Apple briefed me on this API twice on 2 separate occasions because, as you might guess, I always say trust but verify. I never take anyone at their word, and I always look under the hood. I always want to make sure. So Apple knows this. They contacted me and walked me through all of the technology twice, 2 separate occasions, to convince me that their API is totally privacy protective. And so in Canada, in Ontario, Canada, my jurisdiction, they built a contact tracing app based on the Apple Google API. In fact, they call it an exposure notification app, not a contact tracing, because it doesn't trace you, it doesn't surveil you, no tracking whatsoever. And it's amazing. All it does, so you would voluntarily download the exposure notification app, and it's adopted across Canada now, and you would download it, and it would simply alert you, notify you, if you've been exposed to someone in public, for example, who is within 6 feet of you or 2 meters, who had tested positive for COVID-19. And then it's up to you what you choose to do with that. You can choose to go to your family doctor or to a public health authority to be tested for COVID-19. It's all up to you. No one will know that you're using this app. No one will know anything about you or any information you get exposed to. That's the beauty of this. I should tell you, about a month ago, Germany created their contact tracing app based on the Apple Google exposure notification app. And everyone, so Germany is probably the most privacy protective country in the world. Their privacy laws, their data protection laws are just amazing, the strongest imaginable. And so their public has a lot of confidence in the Privacy Commission, Data Protection Commission in Germany. And so when Germany created this exposure notification app, and it was supported by the privacy commissioner, data protection commissioner. They had total trust in it. Within 24 hours, 6.5 million people had downloaded the app within 24 hours. That was a long time ago. So it's probably doubled. That's the amazing thing. You must have trust in order for this to work, and it will work. If you want to check it out, take a look at the Apple Google Exposure Notification app. As I said, we have it here in Canada. And in fact, a number of jurisdictions that started out with a contact tracing app that identified individuals, like the UK and Australia and Alberta, they've dropped them and they've now switched to the Apple Google API. That's what a big deal was, because none of the members of the public were using an identifiable contact tracing app. That's not what it's intended to do. Now, let me just end, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. Thank you for letting me expose you to privacy and security issues that are prevalent, and that these can best be managed through, in my view, through privacy by design, in an effort to prevent the privacy harms from arising. Just avoid the data breaches and embed privacy into your code, bake it into the code. If you focus on prevention, then it's much easier and far more cost effective to build privacy and security into your operations, because then you can deal with this up front. It also reflects the most ethical treatment of personal data. And there's been so much talk about ethics these days. Privacy by design embeds ethics into its core, into its operations. To me, they're one and the same. And most important, get rid of zero-sum thinking, the either-or mindset, win-lose, one versus the other. No, get rid of that. You need both. You need privacy and security. You need privacy and business interests, privacy and marketing. Every year, the Canadian Marketing Association, they invite me to give a keynote at their annual conference. And I always start by saying, I'm sure I'm the least popular speaker here today. And fortunately, they laugh and they say, yeah, but we know we've got to hear what you're saying and build privacy into this somehow. You can do both. You have to do both. So let's address these issues, privacy and, not privacy versus. Remember, privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. You cannot have free and open societies without a solid foundation of privacy. And I have to mention here, I'm Armenian. That's my background. My grandparents barely escaped the Armenian genocide in 1915. So to me, freedom is everything. And you can't have freedom without a solid foundation of privacy. Thank you so much for your time. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was really insightful and interesting. And thank you for putting some deep philosophical basis there at the end.
Thank you.
So we're waiting for some questions. I'm going to ask first, I'm going to kind of enjoy my privilege of being session chair here, and ask about what do you think should be, the 8th principle of privacy by design, or where privacy by design should, continue and develop in the future?
I would tackle artificial intelligence. AI is growing dramatically, as you know, and people are getting very concerned that AI can, in effect, take over without addressing the concerns about privacy and individuals' control, the need to reflect individuals' presence in the decisions made by artificial intelligence. So I would deal with AI issues.
Okay, that's great. So we have 2 questions here. Anne, do you want to read them yourself, or should I read them to you? They're in the chat.
Could you read them to me? Because I can't see them. If you could read them, that would be great.
So one from Moshe Shore. What's your opinion on compelled disclosure of passwords?
I am opposed to compelling anything. Passwords, PIN numbers. I have a real problem with that. That's why I love Apple's framework. With Apple, there was a case in the United States several years ago where the FBI went to Apple and they said, look, we've got this guy, we've arrested him, and we want to break into his iPhone, but we need his PIN number. So can you give it to us, his password, whatever. Apple said no. They said, we don't have it. We have end-to-end encryption, and the only person that can open their iPhone is the individual. We have placed control over that information in the hands of the individual. We can't break into it. And the FBI said, but surely you can figure out how to do this. And they said, yeah, we could figure out how to do it, but that's not our business model. We don't do it. And they persisted and they won. The FBI had to back out of it. Now, unfortunately, there is an Israeli company who is brilliant and can break the code. So I'm not going to go there. But I personally do not think you should be breaking into anyone's code or password or PIN number.
Yeah, definitely. Another question from Moshe, and this is a question I get asked a lot, and I guess so many people who work on privacy get to ask a lot. With respect to IoT, why isn't "don't connect your juicer to the internet" the answer? And I guess we have very similar questions. Don't open a Facebook account. Don't open a Twitter account.
Oh, because, and I understand the sentiment, but we have to get real. The reality these days is people are on the internet. They're on Facebook. They're on, all these things on Google, and, they are there. That's the reality. You can't ask people not to use the existing technology because everybody else is using it, and people are going to get drawn in, unfortunately. But it's the reality. I mean, I'm not on Facebook, but I'm probably the only person in North America who's not on Facebook. And can I tell you a story? At the early days, Mark Zuckerberg invited me down to Palo Alto, California, to speak to his team about privacy in Facebook, early 2000s. And he was very into privacy back then. And I was delighted. And they have a wonderful chief privacy officer back then. It was all good. Then they hired Sheryl Sandberg, I think the next year. And, the business model changed and privacy went out the door. So unfortunately, it is what it is, and it is a reality. So I'm not going to tell people stop doing this, because they're not going to stop doing this. And I know that's the reality. But what I urge people to do, you're not going to believe this. Facebook, I was at a conference a number of years ago, and Sheryl Sandberg and their chief privacy officer was there, Agan. And she said to me, oh, are you coming to my session? I'm going to be speaking. I'm going to be doing a shout out about privacy by design, because on Facebook, we've actually embedded privacy by design. And I said, oh, thank you, but I'm speaking at my own session. Now, what I understand is, but you have to find it. That's the problem. If you search really hard on Facebook, there is a privacy by design area where you can strongly protect your privacy and only have your Facebook images go to the 5 people you want, your family, friends, or whoever. But you've got to search for it. So that's what I'm telling people in all of these things to do. I'm not going to tell people don't use the technology, because that's not going to work. I'm going to say search for the most privacy protective measures you can take while using that technology, making it a win-win.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Louisa Jarowski. She's, by the way, I'm proud to advise her in her PhD alongside Michael Bernack. So she asks about, I'm going to read it and then I'm going to frame it as a good advisor. Do you think we can leave it to the companies / market to define what is enough in terms of privacy protective design? Don't we need some form of government oversight or enforcement to guarantee a high level of protection? And I guess this is a deep question that goes into the autonomy versus oversight question of privacy by design.
Of course, I always say, don't just trust the company. You have to have strong privacy protective measures, and they have to walk the talk. So that speaks to it has to be strongly enforced. I totally agree with that. The reality is this, and I speak as a former privacy commissioner. It takes a lot of effort and a big budget to go after everyone. And privacy commissioners don't have that. So you have to pick and choose, which is what I always try to do. But the reality is, privacy laws these days, they all need to be updated. Certainly, let me speak for Canada. We have a very strong privacy commissioner federally, but our federal private sector legislation is so weak. Facebook, for God's sakes, Cambridge Analytica, our privacy commissioner of Canada, found them in breach of our law last year. What did they do? Facebook basically thumbed their nose at the privacy commissioner. So big deal. We don't agree with you. So what he's taken now, the commissioner has taken Facebook to court in Canada, because that's the only means he has to do anything about it. And it costs a lot of money to do that. And his budget is limited, unfortunately. So he is actually doing that. I applaud him for that. But what I'm saying is most budgets will not enable this. So when I was commissioner, I would choose one or two very high profile cases that I would go, but I was lucky. I had order making power. An order is I could order an institution, a government department to take corrective action. And they would have to do that unless they took me to court, which they never did. So I'm saying that it's true. We don't just trust companies to do this. And it would be great if we had strong means of enforcement. Generally speaking, we don't. So what I always do, I like to go to companies now in my capacity as a privacy consultant. And what I say to them is you're going to lose business if you don't strongly protect your customers' privacy. Here are the complaints we've already received. Let me help you gain a competitive advantage by embedding privacy by design into your operations. We now offer privacy by design certification in conjunction with KPMG. They go in and they certify that you're doing privacy by design. And usually they have to strengthen the measures they have in place, which we assist them in doing. That way, they can then speak publicly and say, we've been certified for privacy by design. And it attracts customers to them. Unfortunately, absent that, an enforcement measure, which is wonderful to have, has to be strong and placed in law, and these are generally lacking.
Yeah, and have you kind of encountered examples where giving more autonomy to engineers actually produced, more protection or kind of more in the scale design of privacy?
Yes, absolutely. I go in and I talk to many companies. I talk to the boards of directors, their CEOs, and I always say, involve your engineers and give them a lot of freedom. Let me speak to them directly, but you have to sign off on this now, because what I'm going to say to them is tell me how you could embed privacy by design directly into your operations. From an engineering perspective, bake it into your code. How could you do that? It's amazing what they can come up with when you take the gloves off and you give them that kind of freedom. But first you have to talk to the CEO and the board of directors and convince them that this is a valuable thing to do, and that's my job. And then once I do that and they say, okay, show me what the engineers can do, it's amazing what they can do. And so I encourage all companies to go in this direction.
Yeah, great. Another question from Dana Turgeman. So she, I assume, asks, deep learning is becoming much more powerful, but also less transparent. We developers and users don't know how the data is used and whether they are causing harm to users' well-being. How can users make informed decisions when they, and even developers themselves, can't tell how the data is used?
It's a very good point. Deep learning, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all of these, of course, exceed the level of understanding or the grasp of average, users or individuals, or even, a lot of tech people don't go into this deeply either. So you're absolutely right. This is why we need trusted frameworks within companies. And this is going to be a new developing field, that we've got to have some type of trust that the tech people within the company who are working with the engineers and the tech designers of the AI and the deep learning, that they're working with them to ensure that privacy is reflected in their operations. We have to have that level of intervention at the level of the company, where they have people who can oversee the work of the designers, of the engineers, of all the tech people, so that they can grasp some kind of understanding of what's happening with deep learning and machine learning and AI. I think this will be the new area that will be expanding in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. Another question that was sent to me via WhatsApp about the kind of the zero, or the kind of questioning this anti-zero-sum game approach. So a company can say, okay, we know that we may gain some users if we protect their privacy more, but we might also make more money if we sell their data. So how can you convince companies that it's profitable, and what happens if it's not? What happens if it's actually a zero-sum game and there's nothing we can do about it?
There's always something you can do about it. And my experience is it comes back to bite them, the company, the lead directors who are going in that direction. Because they're thinking, oh, we can get by. We don't need privacy. We're going to make a lot of money by selling this data, and there's no big deal. Maybe in the short run, they may make some money on this, but in the long run, invariably, people find out about it. Their customers find out about it. And that's when I said earlier, they're not just lawsuits against companies, they're class action lawsuits. The cost is staggering in the millions in terms of how it comes back to bite the company who has completely ignored privacy. So it's a short-sighted view that they think they'll get away with it. They may get away with it in the short term, but invariably long term, it comes back to bite them. And there are so many companies that have been bitten. So that's why I urge people not to go in that that direction.
Okay, great. I think.
Can I also?
Yeah.
You mentioned the face recognition in a way that you mentioned it's privacy, and there are various ways to take biometry. For example, face recognition, for example, fingerprints, or iris, or blood types, or various other types of biometry. Are there ones that are better than others in various terms? For example, you can see the face from far away by cameras, or you leave your fingerprints. Probably iris is more difficult for people to take where you are not around, or without your knowledge, some others you need the acceptance, the agreement of the person you take the biometry of. So are there any ways to compare which is better for various applications?
That's a good question. I have concern associated with the majority of biometrics. Of course, fingerprints, facial recognition, these are the primary biometrics. There are a number of others. Voice, generally speaking, is fairly safe. But the most that I have become aware of in terms of the inaccuracies associated with biometrics have been in the area of facial recognition, the use of facial images. The false positives are just resoundingly high. The two studies I mentioned were 81% in the UK, 96% in the United States. They're just outrageously inaccurate. Fingerprints tend to be perhaps more accurate, but we often don't have people's fingerprints. Facial images you have, because everybody's out in the streets, you have facial images that are picked up by cameras. So it's much more susceptible to people gaining access inappropriately to facial images. And the harms are just endless. So I always alert people to address facial recognition problems. In the United States, for example, a number of states are banning facial recognition outright bans. The government is not permitted to use it. And 3 companies, Microsoft, IBM, and Amazon, have also just recently instituted a ban on their use of facial recognition because the privacy harms are just too great. and they're not using it anymore. So this is the direction I'm hoping we can push people into, both governments and private sector entities, that the gains of facial recognition are minimal when compared to the harms. So I'm hoping we'll be going in that direction. Okay, thank you very much for your time. Aaron, I'll put it back to you.
Go ahead, and let me. I'll let you. I let you summarize it and say thanks, and then I'm going to say thanks to you.
Okay, I'm very grateful for your time, and I'm also just want to drive home the need never to give up on privacy, because a lot of people say to me, you know, I tweet every morning the stories of the day, and I have a large Twitter following. Invariably, I get a few tweets back from people who say, lady, give it up, privacy's dead, that ship has sailed. And I say, get another friggin' ship. You don't give up on privacy just because it's hard, just because the odds against it are mounting. No, you always insist upon protecting privacy, and we will increasingly find ways to do it. One final note, I'm working with Microsoft now, who's really big on something called decentralized identification. They're increasingly placing their identifiers in a decentralized manner where you, the individual, have personal control over your identifiers, perhaps in a secure enclave in the cloud or wherever, with verifiable credentials. This is huge. And it's not just Microsoft. There's a whole foundation called the Decentralized Identity Foundation. Lots of companies, including IBM and Evernym and Sovereign, and so many companies that are going in the direction of decentralized identification, which places controls back in the hands of the individual. So every time somebody says, give up, lady, that ship has sailed, I point them to another ship that shows what is taking place to increase privacy and strengthen our freedom. Never give up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I think it's a great summary for this fascinating lecture. So I think there's Ellie, I'm going to pass the button to you.
And John, the thanks to Anne. And we will continue in 7 minutes with Kamalika Chonduri's talk. Local time, it will be 6 o'clock, but probably in your place it's different. So see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Yeah.